They killed it once, spent a decade making sure everyone knew it could never come back. Northern Gateway was dead, the tanker ban was permanent, and the conversation was over. Then 3 months ago, the man who lost $373 million the last time said 3 words that changed everything. He said Enbridge would definitely consider it. Greg Ebel doesn't do hype. He's the chief executive of Enbridge, the largest pipeline company in Canada. And he runs a business where decisions are measured in 20-year contracts, and where getting it wrong means lighting hundreds of millions of dollars on fire, which is exactly what happened the last time his company tried to build a pipeline to the West Coast. In February, he sat down with Bloomberg and said his company would not take on the development risk of a new pipeline to British Columbia. Not now, not under the current rules, not after what the government did to them in 2016. By March, the language softened. He wouldn't say a hard no. And on May 15th, hours after Prime Minister Mark Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith signed an energy memorandum in Calgary, Ebel used a phrase that has already begun to reshape how the financial press in Toronto and the political press in Ottawa are reading the next decade of Canadian energy policy. He called the new framework a page flip. 3 months, 3 sentences, 1 Canadian pipeline giant, and a regulatory environment that the chief executive himself has now publicly conceded is no longer the regulatory environment that killed Northern Gateway a decade ago. To understand why those 3 words matter, you have to go back to November 29, 2016. That's the day Justin Trudeau stood on Parliament Hill and told the country that the Great Bear Rainforest was no place for a pipeline and the Douglas Channel was no place for oil tanker traffic. With that sentence, his cabinet killed Enbridge's Northern Gateway proposal. 1,177 kilometers of pipeline that would have moved 525,000 barrels of diluted bitumen a day from Bruderheim, Alberta, to a deepwater port at Kitimat, BC. The Federal Court of Appeal had already overturned the project's approval earlier that year, citing inadequate consultation with First Nations. The Trudeau government chose not to reopen consultation. They just killed it. Then in 2019, Parliament made the death permanent. They legislated the tanker ban into law as the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act, banning vessels carrying more than 12,500 metric tons of crude from a long stretch of the British Columbia North Coast. Court ruling, cabinet rejection, legislated ban. That's the sequence Greg Ebel was talking about in February, when he said hundreds of millions had been lit on fire. The numbers were specific. The Canadian government quietly refunded Enbridge $14.7 million in regulatory fees in 2018. Enbridge's own ledger logged a further $373 million in unrecovered development spending. The wound was financial, but it was also institutional. For nearly a decade, Enbridge's senior leadership treated the question of a new West Coast oil pipeline as politically foreclosed. You don't ask the question when the answer has been legislated into permanent law. You don't spend shareholder money on a project that a federal cabinet has already killed once. You move on. And they did. Until November 27, 2025, when Mark Carney and Danielle Smith signed a memorandum of understanding in Calgary that changed the math. Here's what the memorandum actually said. In exchange for an industrial carbon price of $130 per ton to be implemented in Alberta by April 1st, Ottawa committed to support the construction of a new bitumen pipeline from Alberta to the northern coast of British Columbia, a pipeline capable of moving an additional 300 to 400,000 barrels per day destined for Asian markets. The memorandum committed Ottawa to suspend the clean electricity regulations in Alberta, and then came the clause that Enbridge's senior leadership has been waiting on since 2017. The memorandum committed Ottawa, in language drawn directly from the signed document, to enable the export of bitumen from a strategic deepwater port to Asian markets, including where necessary through an appropriate adjustment to the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act. That clause, the tanker ban clause, is the unlock, because without it, none of this works. You can build the pipeline, you can sign every regulatory approval in the country, but if you can't get tankers into the Douglas Channel, you can't get Canadian crude to Asian buyers. And if you can't get it to Asian buyers, the price differential between Canadian and American crude stays exactly where it's been for 2 decades, costing the Canadian Treasury billions of dollars a year. The interesting fact is, who else noticed? Brian Tobin, the former Chrétien-era cabinet minister, who now serves as vice chair of BMO Financial Group, told the Hill Times in late November that on Bay Street there is a quiet buzz about what is being rolled out and an anticipation of opportunities in 2026 and beyond. He described a strong response within the finance community, within the engineering community, within the construction community. Tobin is not a man given to overstatement. He served in federal cabinet through one of the most consequential decades of Canadian economic policy in the modern era. When a man of his experience uses the phrase quiet buzz about Canadian energy capital, it deserves attention. But there's a counterweight. Adam Waterous, the executive chairman of Strathcona Resources, was less generous in his assessment of the Carney-Smith deal. For Canada to have a regulatory and carbon framework competitive with the US, he said in a statement quoted by Rigzone on May 18th, there is still much work to be done. Two senior figures, one capital markets veteran, one operating company chairman, looking at the same memorandum and reaching different conclusions about whether the page has truly turned. That disagreement is the texture of the moment. But the disagreement is also in its own way, proof that the moment is real. 3 months ago, no senior Canadian executive was debating the merits of a new West Coast pipeline. They were debating whether one was conceivable. The conversation has moved. And here's where the long shadow begins. When Trudeau killed Northern Gateway in 2016, his environment minister was a Quebec politician named Stephen Guilbeault. On the day the Carney-Smith memorandum was signed in November, Guilbeault, by then a senior minister in Carney's own cabinet, resigned. He resigned over this. He resigned over a pipeline he had spent his political life opposing. That resignation, more than any clause in the memorandum, is the political weather report. A Liberal cabinet that loses its most prominent climate minister over a West Coast pipeline is a Liberal cabinet that has chosen the pipeline. That's the calculation Greg Ebel was reading when he sat down with Bloomberg on May 15th and used the phrase page flip, and then the markets answered. Or more precisely, the consequences began to cascade. Within days of the signing, the Federal Major Projects Office became the center of gravity for what the industry calls submission readiness. The technical work of preparing a formal pipeline proposal. Alberta committed $14 million in provincial funding for early regulatory work, with a proposed pipeline submission due to Ottawa on or before July 1, 2026, and a federal target of a conditions document by September 1, 2027. If the timeline holds, construction could begin in 2027, 11 years after Northern Gateway was killed in the same political capital. The speed is notable. This is not a government testing the waters. This is a government that has made a decision and is now engineering the regulatory pathway to execute it. The Federal Major Projects Office doesn't become the center of gravity unless the decision has already been made at the cabinet level. The regional response has been split along familiar lines. British Columbia Premier David Eby has rejected the project's premise, telling reporters in late November that the tanker ban is a foundational and critical catalyst for economic activity on his coast. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs has called for the withdrawal of the deal. The Assembly of First Nations has demanded the same. Stand, Earth, the environmental group whose campaign helped sink Northern Gateway a decade ago, issued a statement reminding Ottawa that hundreds of thousands of Canadians marched in front of the National Energy Board to stop the last attempt. The opposition is not theoretical. It is the same coalition, the same legal architecture, and in many cases, the same people who won the last fight. They know how to do this. They have the case law, they have the precedent, and they have a provincial government in Victoria that is ideologically opposed to the project. But here's the dimension most coverage missed. Compared to 2016, the strategic context is no longer the strategic context that allowed Trudeau to say no. The Trump tariff regime to the south has made Canadian energy export diversification a question of national economic sovereignty. Enbridge's own mainline pipeline is moving 3.2 million barrels a day, apportioned every month of the year, almost entirely into a United States market that the Carney government no longer trusts as a long-term destination. The April approval of Enbridge's $4 billion Sunrise gas expansion in British Columbia, the first major pipeline approval of Carney's mandate, was Ottawa's first signal. The May memorandum was the second. The Able page flip interview was the third. This is not a random sequence. This is a government that is signaling to capital markets that the rules have changed and that the window is open. And this is the part that affects you directly. If a new West Coast pipeline is built, Asian market access for Canadian bitumen will, within a decade, alter the price differential between Canadian and American crude. A discount that has cost the Canadian Treasury, on industry estimates, billions of dollars a year for 2 decades. That money flows directly and indirectly into provincial royalties, federal corporate taxes, pension fund returns on Canadian energy equities, and the long-term solvency of the public retirement systems that millions of Canadians of our generation are now drawing on. Whatever one may think of the climate consequences, and they are real and they are serious, the fiscal consequences of a decade-long discount on the largest export industry in the country are also real. They have been borne quietly by every Canadian taxpayer since 2016. That is the calculation Ottawa has now reversed. The price differential between Western Canadian Select and West Texas Intermediate has averaged between $10 and $20 per barrel for the better part of a decade. On a production base of roughly 4 million barrels per day, that differential represents billions in foregone revenue every single year. Revenue that could have funded infrastructure, healthcare, education, or simply reduced the federal deficit. Instead, it subsidized American refineries on the Gulf Coast, who bought Canadian crude at a steep discount and sold the refined products at global prices. Here's what it amounts to. In February, The chief executive of the largest pipeline company in Canada said no. In March, he softened. On May 15th, sitting in a Bloomberg studio hours after the memorandum was signed in Calgary, he used the phrase page flip. 3 months, 3 statements, one country at a strategic inflection point it has been postponing since 2016. A decade ago, Justin Trudeau stood at a podium in Ottawa and said the Great Bear Rainforest was no place for a pipeline. The sentence ended a project, ended a regulatory chapter, and ended, for nearly 10 years, the question of a new oil corridor to the British Columbia coast. On November 27, 2025, his successor stood at a different podium in Calgary and signed the agreement that reopened it. His most prominent climate minister resigned the same day. His most senior pipeline executive in the country 3 months later used the phrase page flip. Greg Ebel was not given to page flips in February. He was not given to page flips in March. On May 15th, he was. The mature reader of Canadian politics knows what that change of vocabulary signals. It signals that the institutional memory of Northern Gateway, the memory of $373 million lit on fire, the memory of a cabinet decision that ended a project mid-stride, the memory of a tanker ban legislated into permanent law, has been judged by the man who carries that memory inside his own balance sheet to no longer apply. Whether the pipeline gets built is a separate question. It will face Indigenous legal challenges. It will face a hostile provincial government in Victoria. It will face the same coalition that defeated the last one. The construction timeline is long. The carbon capture conditions are demanding. The Pathways Alliance commitment is unfinished. Any one of these can still end the project, but the regulatory environment that made the answer no for a decade is gone. The chief executive who has the most to lose from being wrong has said so on the record. The page in his own phrase has been flipped.